The man did not rush, and that was the first thing everyone noticed, because in rooms like this, power never hurried. It arrived exactly when it meant to, and as his polished shoes crossed the marble floor, a subtle shift moved through the crowd like a quiet tide pulling back before a storm. People stepped aside without being asked, conversations stopped without being told, and even those who did not recognize him immediately felt something they could not name, something that made them straighten their posture and lower their voices. While Emily stood there still, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the delicate fabric she could barely hold together, trying to make sense of why this man, a stranger, was looking at her as if the entire night revolved around her existence. And then he stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to see the faint lines at the corner of his eyes, the kind that came from years of control, decisions, and consequences, and for a second, no one spoke, not Vanessa, not Daniel, not even the event host who had been guiding the evening with rehearsed charm, because something unspoken demanded silence. And when the man finally did speak, his voice was not loud, but it carried with a clarity that cut through the room. "Who did this?" he said slowly, his gaze never leaving Emily's face. And it was not a question filled with confusion. It was a statement searching for truth. And the effect was immediate. Vanessa's confident posture faltered just enough to be noticed, her smile tightening at the edges as she glanced around, expecting someone else to respond, expecting the moment to pass. But no one moved, and Daniel finally shifted, just slightly, as if realizing too late that the rules of the room had changed, that whatever control he believed he had was slipping through his fingers in real time. And Emily felt it too, not as relief, not yet, but as a crack in the weight pressing down on her, a single moment where the air felt different, where the whispers stopped sounding like judgment and started sounding like uncertainty. And still, she did not speak, because she did not understand why this man was here, why his presence alone had silenced a room that had just seconds ago watched her humiliation like it was entertainment. And then he took one more step forward, his expression tightening ever so slightly as his eyes moved from her trembling hands to the visible distress she could no longer hide. And something deeper flickered beneath his composure, something protective, something personal. And that was when the shift became undeniable, because people in the room began to recognize him, one by one, a quiet ripple of realization spreading from the front rows to the back, names whispered under breaths, phones subtly lowered, attention redirected. And suddenly Vanessa was no longer the center of attention, and Daniel was no longer the man everyone watched, because the power in the room had been reassigned without announcement. And Emily, still standing in the same spot, still holding herself together piece by piece, became the axis everything turned around. And for the first time that night, the story was no longer about her being small. It was about something much larger beginning to reveal itself, something no one there was prepared to face. Remembered too late, and Emily felt it, the distance in his voice, the absence of any real protection. And for a brief second, she considered speaking, explaining, defending herself, but something held her back, something about the way the man in front of her had not looked away, not even once, as if he already understood more than anyone else in the room. And then he turned his head slightly toward Daniel, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence. And when he spoke again, his tone did not rise, it did not sharpen, it simply carried a weight that made Daniel's next breath hesitate. "You will not speak for her," he said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no space for interpretation. And that was when the tension shifted again, because this was no longer a misunderstanding or a social misstep. This was a boundary being drawn in real time. And for the first time that evening, Daniel looked uncertain, his confidence flickering under the gaze of a man he was now beginning to recognize, a man whose name was quietly passing from one guest to another like a secret too powerful to say out loud. And Vanessa noticed it too, the subtle change in Daniel's posture, the way his shoulders no longer held the same ease, and her smile tightened as she tried to regain control, stepping closer as if proximity could restore her advantage. "I think you are overreacting," she said, her voice sharper now. "This is just a dress, and she made quite the entrance, do not you think?" But the words did not land the way she intended, because the room was no longer listening to her. Not really. Their attention had shifted completely. drawn toward the man who now took one final step forward, closing the distance between himself and Emily. And for a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The music, the chatter, the judgment, all of it dissolving into a silence that felt almost unreal. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to the room, not to Daniel, not to Vanessa, but to Emily, his voice softer now, carrying something unmistakably personal. "Look at me," he said, and slowly, hesitantly, she did, her eyes meeting his, searching for answers she had not expected to find. Tonight, and in that quiet exchange, something passed between them that no one else could fully understand: recognition, certainty, something deeper than coincidence. And then he straightened, his expression settling into something unshakable, something final, as he turned back to face the room, and in a voice that did not need to rise to command absolute attention, he said, "Her name is Emily Carter." A simple sentence, but the effect was immediate, because now the whispers changed, now the realization began to form. Now the pieces that had not made sense were starting to align, and the question was no longer who she was, but who they had just humiliated in front of the one man they should never have crossed. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the moment it left his lips, it carried a weight that settled over every person in the room, and one by one, expressions began to change, confusion giving way to recognition, recognition turning into something far less comfortable, because Carter was not just a name, it was a legacy, a foundation, a network of companies and influence that stretched far beyond the walls of this ballroom. And suddenly the question was no longer about Emily's place in the room. It was about everyone else's, and Daniel felt it first, the shift beneath his feet, the quiet realization creeping in as he looked from the man standing before him to the woman he had just failed to defend, his mind racing through memories, through conversations, through every moment he had dismissed her silence as weakness instead of something else entirely, and for the first time, uncertainty turned into something sharper, something closer to concern, while Vanessa's composure began to crack in small, almost imperceptible ways, her posture stiffening, her gaze darting briefly toward the guests around her, as if searching for reassurance that no longer existed. But no one stepped in, no one laughed now, no one whispered support, because the room had already chosen its side, and it was not hers. And then the man took a slow breath, his presence steady, controlled, as if he had seen moments like this unfold 100 times before, but this one mattered differently. This one was personal, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, it did not need to, because every ear in the room was already tuned to him. "You seem to misunderstand something," he said, his gaze moving briefly to Vanessa, then to Daniel, not with anger, but with a clarity that felt far more final. "She was not trying to belong here," he continued, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "This event exists because of her family," and the silence that followed was immediate and absolute, the kind of silence that felt heavier than any noise, because now there was no room left for interpretation, no space for denial, only the truth standing plainly in front of them. And Emily felt it wash over her in a way she could not fully describe, not as triumph, not as relief, but as something steadier, something grounding, as if the invisible line that had been drawn around her all night had finally been erased, and she was no longer standing alone inside it. And Daniel's face changed then, the confidence gone completely, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to realization, his eyes lingering on Emily, as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, not as an accessory to his life, not as a quiet presence he could overlook, but as someone he had fundamentally misunderstood. And the weight of that realization was not subtle. It settled into his posture, into the way his shoulders dropped ever so slightly, while Vanessa took a step back without meaning to, her control slipping in the smallest but most telling way, because the narrative she had built in her mind, the version of events where she held the upper hand, was unraveling piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And across the room, guests who had once turned away were now watching closely, not out of curiosity, but out of calculation, because alliances in rooms like this were never fixed. They shifted with power, and power had just revealed its true position, and in the center of it all stood Emily, still holding herself together, still breathing through the moment, but no longer shrinking beneath it, because the story had changed completely, and there was no going back to what it had been just minutes before. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire ballroom had forgotten how to breathe, because what had just been said could not be undone, and more importantly, it could not be ignored, and Emily felt it in the way the air shifted around her, in the way the eyes that once judged her now searched for something else, something closer to understanding, or perhaps regret, while the man beside her remained steady, his presence no longer just commanding but protective in a way that was impossible to misinterpret, and Daniel finally spoke again. But this time his voice lacked the polished certainty it had carried before. "Emily, why did you not tell me?" he said, the question sounding less like an accusation and more like a realization that had arrived far too late, and she turned her head slightly toward him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that he was there, and for the first time that night, her expression was calm, not defensive, not hurt, just calm, as if something inside her had settled the moment the truth stepped into the room. "You never asked," she replied quietly, and the simplicity of her answer landed harder than anything else that had been said, because it revealed something deeper than the situation itself, something about the years that had led to this exact moment. And Daniel had no response, none that could fix what had already been exposed, while Vanessa, who had once stood so confidently at the center of attention, now found herself shifting backward. Again, her mind clearly searching for a way to recover control, to reshape the narrative. "This is ridiculous," she said, her tone sharper now, less composed. "None of this changes what happened." She still embarrassed herself. But even as she spoke, the words felt hollow, disconnected from the reality forming around her, because no one was looking at Emily that way anymore. No one saw her as out of place, not after understanding who she truly was, and the man turned his gaze to Vanessa once more, not with anger, but with a quiet finality that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. "What changes," he said, slowly, "is how the rest of this night will be remembered." And that sentence lingered, hanging in the air like a promise, because in rooms like this, reputation was currency, and once lost, it was rarely recovered, and around them, people began to adjust, subtle movements that spoke volumes, invitations mentally withdrawn, partnerships reconsidered, alliances quietly shifting, all without a single announcement, because no one wanted to be on the wrong side of what was unfolding, and Emily felt. A steady breath returned to her chest, her hand still resting protectively over her belly, but her posture no longer shrinking, no longer apologizing for existing in a space she had every right to occupy. And then the man did something unexpected, something that did not match the tension of the moment. He reached for his jacket, removing it with a calm, deliberate motion, and without a word, he placed it gently over her shoulders, shielding her from the lingering stares, not as a gesture of pity, but as a quiet acknowledgement of dignity, and the simplicity of it spoke louder than anything else that had happened, because it was not about power in that moment. It was about respect, and Emily's fingers lightly held the fabric in place, her eyes lowering for a second before lifting again, stronger now, steadier, and across from her, Daniel watched it all unfold, understanding finally settling in with a clarity he could not escape, that whatever he thought he controlled, whatever he believed, he understood, had just slipped beyond his reach, and the night was no longer his to manage. It belonged to a truth he had ignored for far too long. The jacket settled over Emily's shoulders like a quiet line drawn between who she had been treated as and who she truly was, and the shift was undeniable now, not just in the room, but inside her, because for the first time that night, she was no longer reacting. She was choosing how to stand, how to breathe, how to exist in a space that had tried to shrink her, and the man beside her did not rush her, did not speak again immediately. He simply remained there, steady, allowing the silence to do what it needed to do, allowing everyone else to feel the weight of what had already been revealed. And across the room, the subtle mechanics of power continued to rearrange themselves, conversations restarting in hushed tones, glances exchanged with new meaning, because this was no longer a spectacle, it was a recalibration, and Daniel felt it more than anyone, standing just outside the center now, no longer the man people instinctively aligned with, but someone being quietly assessed, his decisions, his silence, his choices all being reconsidered in real time. And that realization did something to him. Something visible in the way he stepped forward again, slower this time, more cautious. "Emily, we should talk," he said, his voice lower, almost careful, as if he understood that whatever came next would not be on his terms. But Emily did not move toward him, not this time. She stayed exactly where she was, her posture composed, her hands still resting over her belly. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "There is nothing to discuss here," she said, and the distinction mattered, because she was not refusing to talk. She was refusing to do it in a space that had already shown her exactly how little it valued her presence. And Daniel paused, the meaning settling in, because for the first time, he was not in control of the moment, and he knew it, while Vanessa, watching all of this unfold, made one last attempt to reclaim something, anything, stepping forward with a forced confidence that no longer held the same weight. "You are all acting like this changes everything," she said, her tone strained beneath its surface. "It does not." But even as she said it, the room answered her without words, because everything had already changed, and the man finally turned his attention fully to her, not sharply, not aggressively, but with a calm that felt absolute. "It changes more than you understand," he said, and then he shifted his gaze briefly toward the surrounding guests, as if acknowledging their presence for the first time, and that small gesture alone was enough to make several people straighten, to make others lower their eyes, because they knew what it meant to be noticed by someone like him. And then he looked back at Emily, his expression softening just slightly, not losing its strength, but revealing something underneath it, something that had nothing to do with business or reputation, something that belonged only to her. "You do not have to stay," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more respect than anything she had heard all evening, because it gave her something no one else had offered, a choice. And Emily took a slow breath, feeling the room one last time, the echoes of what had happened, the weight of what had been revealed, and then she made her decision, not rushed, not emotional, just certain. She stepped forward, not toward Daniel, not toward Vanessa, but toward the exit, her movement calm, measured, each step steady, and as she passed through the crowd, people moved without being asked, creating space for her in a way they had not before, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And behind her, the silence followed, not empty, but full of everything that had just been understood, and Daniel stood there watching, realizing that the moment he thought he could control had already slipped away, while Vanessa remained still, her earlier confidence replaced by something far less certain, because the night was not ending the way she had imagined, not even close, and the man waited just long enough for Emily to reach the doors before turning slightly, his presence still anchoring the room, but his attention already elsewhere, because what mattered most had already walked out, and nothing that remained could undo it. The doors closed softly behind Emily, but the silence they left behind inside the ballroom felt louder than anything that had happened all night, because when she walked out, she did not just leave the room, she took the center of it with her, and for several long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, as if they were all waiting for something else to happen, something to restore the balance they were used to, but nothing came, and the man remained where he was, his gaze lingering on the closed doors just a moment longer before he turned back to face what remained, and when he did, the atmosphere shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that made it clear the night was not over, not for them. And Daniel was the first to feel it, standing there with the weight of everything settling in, realizing that the absence of Emily was not relief, it was consequence. And for the first time, he looked around and saw the room differently, saw the subtle distance in people's eyes, the way conversations no longer included him the same way, the way a few individuals had already turned away, quietly, disengaging. And it did not take long for him to understand why, because in spaces like this, perception was everything, and tonight, his had shifted in a way that could not be ignored, and Vanessa, still standing near where it had all begun, felt it too, though she refused to fully accept it, her posture stiff, her expression controlled, but the absence of support around her was unmistakable, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried less confidence than before. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, But no one answered, not even Daniel. And that silence was more telling than any response could have been, because it confirmed what she was not ready to admit, that whatever narrative she had built was no longer the one people believed. And the man stepped forward then, not toward her, not toward Daniel, but toward the center of the room, reclaiming a space that had already begun to reorganize itself around him. And when he spoke, it was not to argue, not to accuse, but to conclude. Tonight was meant to represent something, he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner. Integrity, partnership, responsibility. And each word seemed to settle into the air with intention. And what we witnessed instead was a failure to recognize those things when they mattered most. And no one interrupted, no one challenged him, because they understood that this was not a conversation. It was a statement, one that would follow them long after the evening ended. And Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, because he knew exactly who those words were meant for, and there was no defense he could offer that would undo what had already been seen. While Vanessa remained still, her earlier certainty replaced by something far less stable, something closer to realization, as the room continued to shift away from her, one quiet decision at a time. And then the man paused, letting the silence settle once more before he added, "Some moments define more than a single night." And with that, he stepped back, not needing to say anything further, because the message had already been delivered. And as the music slowly returned, hesitant at first, then steadier, the illusion of normalcy attempted to rebuild itself. But it was different now, undeniably so, because everyone present understood that what had happened would not stay in this room. It would travel, it would be remembered, and more importantly, it would reshape how each person here was seen. And outside, beyond the heavy doors, Emily stood beneath the quiet night sky, the sounds of the city distant but steady, her breath finally even, her posture no longer burdened by the weight she had carried inside. And though the night was not what she had expected, it had revealed something far more important than she had planned for, something that could not be taken back. And behind her, inside that ballroom, the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The cool night air met Emily's skin like a quiet reset, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension she had just walked away from. And for a moment, she simply stood there beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, her hand still resting gently over her belly, as if grounding herself in something real, something that had not changed despite everything else shifting around her. And the city moved on as if nothing had happened, cars passing, distant voices echoing, life continuing in a way that felt almost surreal after the intensity of what she had just left behind. But inside her, something had settled, not relief exactly, but clarity, the kind that comes only after a truth is forced into the open. And she closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath, letting the weight of the night fall away piece by piece, while behind her, the doors opened again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for her to hear the faint shift. And she did not need to turn to know who it was, because some presences carried a certainty that did not require confirmation. And a few seconds later, his voice reached her, calm, steady. "You should not have had to go through that," he said, not as an apology, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. And Emily opened her eyes, turning slowly this time, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because something between them had already been established inside that room, something that did not need to be explained. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no urgency here, no pressure to fill the silence, only a shared understanding of what had just happened and what it meant. And then she gave a small nod, not dismissive, not overly emotional, just acknowledging the truth of his words. "I am fine," she said quietly. And he studied her for a second longer, not doubting her, but recognizing the strength it took to say that and mean it. And then he glanced briefly back toward the building, where the faint hum of the Gala continued, a distant echo of a world that had already begun to shift without her. "They will feel this," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. And there was no anger in his tone, only certainty, the kind that came from experience, from knowing exactly how consequences moved through rooms like that, slowly at first, then all at once. And Emily followed his gaze for a moment before looking away again, because whatever happened inside no longer defined her, not anymore. And that realization brought with it a quiet strength, something steady and unshakable. And then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card, simple, unmarked except for a name and a number, and he held it out to her without insistence, without expectation. "If you need anything," he said. And again, it was not a gesture of control. It was an offering, one that respected her choice, her independence, her space. And Emily looked at it for a moment before taking it, her fingers brushing against the edge as she slipped it into her hand, and for a brief second, the weight of that small piece of paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented: connection, protection, possibility. And then a car pulled up quietly at the curb, its engine humming softly, the driver stepping out to open the rear door with practiced precision, and the man gave a slight nod, not to her, but to the driver, before turning his attention back to Emily one last time. "You have more control than you think," he said, his voice softer now, carrying something almost like reassurance. And she held his gaze for a second longer, absorbing the meaning behind the words, because tonight had proven something she had not fully realized before, that the version of herself others had seen was never the full picture. And as she stepped toward the car, her movements calm and deliberate, she did not look back at the building, not even once, because whatever remained inside was no longer hers to carry. And as the door closed behind her and the car pulled away into the quiet rhythm of the city, the story that had begun in that ballroom was far from over. It had only just started to reveal what it would become. By the time the car disappeared into the flow of traffic, the night had already begun rewriting itself, not in headlines or loud announcements, but in quiet decisions made behind closed doors and inside the ballroom. The illusion of elegance continued, but it was thinner now, fragile, like something that could not quite hold its shape after being cracked. And Daniel remained where he was for a long moment, the echo of Emily's absence settling into him in a way he could not ignore, because for the first time, the consequences were not abstract. They were immediate, visible in the way conversations no longer circled back to him, in the way a few key figures avoided eye contact entirely. And he understood, slowly but unmistakably, that this was not about one moment. It was about everything that moment had revealed. And Vanessa, standing just a few feet away, felt it unraveling in real time. The distance growing between her and the room she had once commanded, and she tried once more to speak, to reframe, to dismiss, but the words did not carry, they did not land, because the audience she relied on had already moved on, their attention recalibrated towards something far more important than her version of events. And at the center of it all, the man who had shifted everything did not need to say another word, because his presence alone had already defined the outcome. And when he finally turned to leave, it was not dramatic, not rushed, just a quiet exit that mirrored the certainty he carried. And that was when the weight truly settled. Because without him, the room did not return to what it was. It remained changed, permanently. And in the days that followed, the ripples of that night moved outward, not loudly, not publicly at first, but through conversations, through decisions, through opportunities that quietly closed or shifted direction. And Daniel felt it in the calls that were not returned, in the meetings that were suddenly postponed, in the subtle but unmistakable cooling of relationships he had once taken for granted. And no one needed to explain why, because everyone had seen enough to understand. While Vanessa found herself navigating a space that no longer responded to her the way it once had, her confidence meeting resistance where it had once found agreement, her presence no longer enough to command attention, because perception had changed, and in circles like these, perception was everything. And far from that ballroom, Emily sat in the quiet of her own space, the events of the night no longer pressing down on her, but settling into something else, something clearer. And she looked at the card in her hand, turning it slightly between her fingers, not as a solution, not as a rescue, but as a reminder of what had been revealed, that she had never been as powerless as she had been treated, that the silence she had lived in was never the whole story. And as she placed the card down beside her, her hand resting once more over her belly, there was no rush in her next decision, no urgency to act, because for the first time, she understood that the timing, the direction, the outcome, All of it could be hers to define, and somewhere across the city, the man who had stepped into that room without hesitation knew the same thing, that this was not the end of what had begun that night. It was only the moment the truth had surfaced, and what followed would not be shaped by noise or spectacle, but by choices, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to undo once made.